One of the most intriguing peoples in the history of the Eurasian steppe was the Khazars. Originally from the Altai Mountains in Central Asia, these Turkic nomads used to belong to the Ashina royal family of the legendary Göktürk Empire. After its disintegration, the Khazars split from the rest and moved westward, arriving in Europe in the 6th century AD. They quickly established their own independent empire with their headquarters in the Caucasus. They slowly advanced into the area of modern-day Ukraine, and from there, the Khazars became known as the supreme rulers of the Eurasian frontier. Within a century, they expanded their territory as far as Kiev in the west, the Volga River in the north, and the Kazakh steppe in the east. While the Khazars seemingly retained their nomadic lifestyle, their society transformed, as many Khazars converted from Tengrism first to Christianity and ultimately to Judaism. But did the Khazar Empire then become a Jewish empire too? Did the common people really adhere to Judaism? And how credible is the claim that the Jews of Eastern Europe were descendants of these Turkic people? Without further ado, let's dive into the fascinating topic of the Khazar Khaganate in this remade documentary, brought to you by Khan's Den.
This documentary presents historical events based on extensive research and available evidence. While Khan's Den always strives for accuracy, interpretations of history may vary. Viewers are encouraged to engage in further study and draw their own conclusions.
Out of all the successor states of the Göktürks, who reigned from the mid-6th to the mid-7th century, the Khazar Empire was indeed the one located most westward, on the frontier between Europe and Asia. Their history can be traced back to the middle of the 7th century, because the creation of Khazar identity is strongly linked to the downfall of the First Turkic Empire. The Göktürks, meaning Celestial Turks, created the first transcontinental steppe empire in history after Buman of the Turkic Ashina tribe defeated his Mongolic overlord Anagui of the Ruran Empire and founded the Turuk-El, the state of the Turk. Buman died young, and his successors expanded the Turk realm into all four directions, striking against the Koreans, Chinese, Tibetans, Hephthalites, and Persians on several occasions. They even advanced as far as Ukraine in the year 580, where they bordered the Byzantine Empire. With the help of the Turkic-Oghur Federation, eastern successors to the Empire of the Huns, the Göktürks besieged Ponticapaion on the Crimean Peninsula, an important Byzantine trade hub. Over time, however, the Byzantines and Turks forged an alliance against their common enemy in between, the Sasanian Persian Empire. In the year 627, hostilities between Byzantines and Persians culminated, and the Turks intervened in the conflict. The ruler of the Turks, a certain Tong Yabgu, besieged several cities in Georgia and Armenia, and sent his general Bori Shad to attack the Persians through Azerbaijan. However, Tong was heinously murdered by his own kin, and consequently, all Turkic armies retreated back to Central Asia amidst political chaos. By 630, the Eastern Göktürk Empire had fallen into Chinese hands, and the Western Empire had also crumbled due to internal conflict between pro-Ashina and anti-Ashina tribes. Tong Yabgu, before his demise, had plans to annex the newly conquered territories on the Caucasus into his Turkic realm, as is evidenced by taxation plans. But even after his death, the Turkic peoples did not fully retreat from the area. Indeed, Tong's war against Persia had laid the foundation of the Khazar state. Because in the subsequent decades, as the Chinese controlled East Asia, the Turkic peoples in the West started reorganizing themselves. The consolidation in the mid-7th century was certainly a complex process, marked by both continuity with their Göktürk heritage and adaptation to new geopolitical realities. Thankfully, we have several contemporary and, in general, medieval sources for the emergence of the Khazar state in that very time period at hand. For example, Byzantine historian Theophanes the Confessor, writing in the early 9th century, first mentions the Khazars as a distinct political entity around 627 AD during the Byzantine-Persian Wars. He notes their involvement in these conflicts, suggesting that even before their formal state formation, the Khazars were already a significant military force in the region, as did Cebeos, a 7th century Armenian historian. He also mentioned the Khazars in the context of their alliance with the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius against the Persians, and referred to them as the nation of the Turkai, indicating their Turkic origins, and describes their swift military movements and formidable fighting skills during the Caucasus campaign. Another Armenian historian, Movses Khaganate, was an eyewitness of the Göktürk invasion of the Caucasus. In his History of the Country of Albania, he describes the events in detail.
At the arrival of the all-powerful scourge confronting us, the invaders, like billowing waves of the sea, crashed against the walls and demolished them to their foundations. In Partaw, seeing the terrible danger from the multitude of hideously ugly, vile, broad-faced and with long flowing hair like women, which descended upon them, a great terror seized the inhabitants. They were even more horrified when they saw the accurate and strong Khazar archers, whose arrows rained down upon them like heavy hailstones, and at how the Khazars, like ravenous wolves that had lost all shame, fell upon them and mercilessly slaughtered them on the streets and squares of the city. Their eyes had no mercy for neither the beautiful, nor handsome, nor the young men or women. They had no pity, compassion, regrets, and their hearts did not shrink at the sight of the babies embracing their murdered mothers. To the contrary, they suckled blood from their breasts like milk.
Lastly, the Arab chronicler al-Tabari, meanwhile, wrote his book History of the Prophets and Kings in the 9th century, but drew on earlier sources. Providing information about the Khazar resistance to Arab expansion, he recorded several battles between the Khazars and the Umayyad Caliphate, highlighting the Khazars' role as a bulwark against Islamic expansion into the Ponto-Caspian region. All of these sources align with the time frame for the reorganization of Turkic peoples in the West, following the disintegration of Turkic unity in Central Asia. The internal structure of the early Khazar state bore strong resemblances to the Göktürk system. The ruling elite maintained the title of Khagan, a clear continuation of Göktürk political traditions. However, as the state evolved, a unique dual kingship developed, where the Khagan served as a sacred figurehead while real power was exercised by a subordinate ruler called the Bek. Sometimes the Bek was called Khagan Bek, which seems like a double title at first glance. This political evolution is hinted at in the account of Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab traveler who visited the Volga region, who gave important accounts about the lifestyles of the Oghuz Turks in Central and the Volga Bulgars in northwestern Asia. Although writing later, his descriptions of Khazar governmental structure reflect earlier developments, providing a glimpse into the sophisticated political system that had developed. The greater king was recruited from the Khazar House of Nobles, and in an initiation ritual, the ruler was nearly strangled until he declared the number of years he wished to reign. Once this reign expired, the ruler would be killed by the nobles. Upon the death of a great ruler, travelers passing near the burial site were required to dismount from their horses and bow in respect before continuing their journey on foot. The final resting place of a particularly venerated Khagan would be concealed from public knowledge completely, similar to the habits of the early rulers of the Mongol Empire like Genghis Khan, whose bearers were killed after Genghis had been laid to rest. Then, hundreds of horsemen rode over the burial ground for so long that the location of the grave could no longer be identified. After these horsemen had done the deed, they too would be killed on orders of ancient Mongol customs. The Bek had an interesting position within the Khazar state. As he was the viceroy, he would, upon entering the Khagan's quarters, remove his footwear and prostrate himself, touching his forehead to the ground in a display of utmost deference. Before addressing the Khagan, the Bek would ignite a fragment of aromatic wood, its smoke serving as a purifying agent, while he awaited the Khagan's summons in respectful silence. Smoke and fire were thought as purifiers among ancient Turkic peoples. The Bek, however, slowly rose to power over the course of 2 centuries, becoming the actual ruler within Khazaria. While the Khazar Khagans took wives and concubines from among their subjects, they were guarded by an elite corps known as the Ursiya, who came from Western Central Asia. The military structure was elaborate and centralized. At the height of their power, they maintained a standing army of considerable size, with the ability to rapidly expand their forces by calling upon the retinues of their nobles. Further, the empire's reach was extensive, controlling and collecting tribute from numerous nations and tribes in a region that stretched from the Caucasus to the Urals and from the Aral Sea to the Ukrainian steppes in the 9th century. This vast network of tributaries contributed greatly to the Khazars' wealth and power. Military leadership was structured under the command of the Khagan Bek, assisted by officers known as Tarkhans, the title for general in Turkic. Khazar military discipline was notoriously strict, with defeat resulting in severe consequences for returning soldiers, a practice that undoubtedly contributed to their fearsome reputation on the battlefield and perhaps adding to the gruesome account of Mavsis from earlier. The administrative structure of the Khazar state also included officials known as tuduns, who governed settlements. In some cases, these tuduns were appointed to oversee towns nominally under the influence of other powers, such as the Byzantine settlements in southern Crimea. While other official titles such as Jewish-Khazar and Kundur are mentioned in historical sources, their specific roles within the Khazar government remain unclear, highlighting the gaps in our knowledge of the intricacies of the Khazar administrative structure. The only other important political title was that of El Tabor, which literally means administrator of the land. Over time, the term Khazar became a polythonym, a political name for a variety of peoples indigenous to the greater Caucasus area. The core tribes were Turkic, most likely stemming from Oghuric-speaking tribes as well as from the Alans. The state included up to 28 ethnicities, many of them non-Turkic. Of course, this development occurred due to the expansion of the Khazar state from a chiefdom to an empire of respectable size. And within this semi-nomadic society, there was constant talk about white and black Khazars. The 10th century Muslim geographer al-Istakhri claimed that the white Khazars were strikingly handsome with reddish hair, white skin, and blue eyes, while the black Khazars were swarthy, verging on deep black, easily confused for Indians. This categorization did not regard the literal looks of the people. White and black were common categories within Turkic societies regarding the social standing of parts of the population. Thus, the white Khazars were of the upper class, often nobles and other wealthy individuals. The black Khazars constituted of the common people, the farmers and hunters, soldiers and merchants. Besides, the Khazars were often described by early Arab sources as having a white complexion, blue eyes, and reddish hair. A similar description can be found with other Turkic peoples, such as the Kyrgyz at the Yenisei River. Social mobility within Khazar state was, however, possible, especially for merchants. Because as the state expanded into Ukraine, the Khazars gained control of important trade hubs from Byzantium to Asia and vice versa. Therefore, the merchants gained not only wealth, but also immense political influence within the Khazar Khaganate. The semi-nomadic life relying on animal husbandry and producing an equestrian society never went completely away. But the Khazars did slowly show signs of a settled society, founding cities such as Itel at the Volga River. The Volga's name among the Turks had been Itel or Atel anyway, and still is to this day. Furthermore, the creation of Kiev, the capital of modern-day Ukraine, can also be attributed to the Khazar Empire. Thus, by the end of the 7th century, the Khazar Khaganate had emerged as a formidable power in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. Their state, while rooted in Turkic traditions, was evolving into a unique political entity that would play a crucial role in the region's history for centuries to come. The stage was set for the Khazars to become, as we noted earlier, the supreme rulers of the Eurasian frontier. But to keep their power and expand upon it, to become more powerful and respected by all, you must confront your enemies first and consolidate your rule. But who did the Khazars fight against the most? The other Turks. The greatest tragedy of Turkic history has always been the endless conflicts among Turkic peoples themselves. The Khazars were no exception. Despite sharing a common heritage, language, and cultural traditions with their Turkic neighbors, they found themselves in frequent military confrontations with their ethnic kin. Their first major adversaries were the Bulgars, themselves Oghur Turkic speakers, and once part of the Onogur Confederation, which, like the local Khazar tribes, had been under the suzerainty of the Göktürk Empire. Theophanes recorded that in 679, the Khazars fought a fierce battle with the Bulgars of Batbayan, the eldest son of Khan Kubrat. The Bulgarian Confederation had taken over the Onogur tribes, but was weakened by internal strife after Kubrat's death. Thus, Batbayan proved no match for the rising power of the Khazars. According to Theophanes, the defeated Bulgars split into 3 groups. One fled westward under Asparuh, eventually settling in the Balkans, while the others moved north to the middle Volga region. The Khazars then subjugated Batbayan's 3rd group. Nikephoros, another important chronicler and once patriarch of Constantinople, provides additional information about these campaigns. He describes how the Khazars systematically dismantled the Bulgarian Confederation, forcing them to abandon their ancestral lands in what is now southern Ukraine. This victory secured Khazar dominance over the western Ponto-Caspian steppes and established them as the preeminent power west and north of the Caucasus. The Bulgars, who had moved into the middle Volga region, created their own Khaganate, but as we saw in the last documentary, they too were at least partially subjugated by the Khazars. Several core clans of Volga Bulgaria, most notably the Turkic Burtis families, were directly under Khazar control. But the Bulgars were just the beginning. The Arab historian al-Baladhuri tells us of subsequent Khazar conflicts with the Pechenegs, another Turkic group pushing westward from Central Asia, whom we dealt with in another previous episode. These Turks had been ejected from Central Asia by several Turkic states. After a devastating defeat at the hands of the Oghuz Yabgu state, the Pechenegs fled westward in search of new pastures for their herds. They found themselves blocked by the power of the Khazar. According to al-Baladhuri, the ensuing clashes were particularly brutal, with neither side willing to submit to the other, but with the Khazars eventually gaining the upper hand and keeping Pecheneg raids at bay. Even more intriguing are the accounts preserved in the Magyar chronicles, particularly the Gesta Hungarorum. These texts reveal how the Khazars dealt with the emerging Magyar Confederation, whom we analyzed a while ago on this channel. Rather than attempting to crush them militarily, the Khazars employed a more subtle approach. They incorporated the Magyars into their defensive system, using them as allies and buffer against other nomadic threats to the north and west. However, this alliance was not always smooth. There are several instances of Magyar-Khazar clashes despite their nominal alliance. After the Magyars had settled in the Don region in what was called Etelköz, the Khazars drove them out completely. By 895, the Magyars left the region and started many military operations into Inner Europe, eventually settling in Pannonia and founding the Kingdom of Hungary a century later. These three peoples, the Bulgars, the Pechenegs, and the Magyars, became a nuisance to the Khazar elite and at the same time allowed them to expand their influence to the west and north. By 900 AD, the Khazar Empire had reached its apex in terms of both territory and political power. Geopolitically, they dominated present-day Ukraine, the Crimean Peninsula, parts of the Don and Volga regions, and eventually the Eurasian frontier into Kazakhstan. In fact, the Oghuz Turks were the fourth group that inadvertently enabled Khazar dominance. While clashes between the Khazar Empire and the Oghuz Yabgu were recorded, a certain Oghuz tribe called Kunuk had cordial relations with the Khazar elite. While this tribe is popularly known as the ancestral tribe of the Seljuk Empire, its founder, a man named Tukak, had different affiliations. In the Turkish Melikname, written during the era of the legendary Seljuk Sultan, Alp Arslan, the victor of Manzikert, Tukak is described as a Khazar Turk and a servant of the ruler of the Khazar Empire. Carrying an iron bow, Tukak participated in many battles on behalf of the Khazar Empire. Sometime later, when the Khazar state collapsed, the connection between the Khazar elite and the Oghuz tribe broke. Then the Kunuk tribe suddenly left the Oghuz Yabgu state, went to Iran, and founded the Seljuk Empire, named after Tukuk's son, Seljuk. It is likely that the Kunuk, who were mentioned in several chronicles at the bottom of the list of tribes within the Oghuz state, came into conflict with the other Oghuz Turks. Perhaps they attempted a power grab and were forced to leave the ancestral Oghuz homeland. But that is a story for another time. To summarize, the Khazar strategy in all of these inter-Turkic conflicts revealed their political sophistication. Unlike many of their predecessors who relied solely on military might, the Khazars employed a combination of force and diplomacy. They would crush those who directly challenged their authority, like the Bulgars, while forming strategic alliances with others, like the early Magyars and parts of the Oghuz. This complex web of conflict and alliance between Turkic peoples would define the political landscape of Eastern Europe for generations to come. But even as the Khazars dealt with their Turkic rivals and subjects, a far more dangerous threat was emerging from the south. The armies of Islam were on the march, and they would present the Khazars with their greatest challenge yet. The First Arab-Khazar War began in 642 AD and would continue sporadically for more than a century. The Armenian historian Ceballos provides us with the earliest account of these conflicts, describing how Arab armies under Abd ar-Rahman ibn Rabia, general of the Rashidun Caliphate, launched their first major offensive through the Caucasus into Khazar territory. The Arabs initially captured Derbent, a strategic fortress city controlling the western shores of the Caspian Sea. But the Khazars would not yield easily. According to the Arab chronicler Al-Tabari, in 652 AD, the Khazars struck back with devastating effect. Their armies, led by the Khazar Khagan, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Arab forces near Balanjar, killing Abd ar-Rahman and forcing the Arabs to retreat south of the Caucasus. As Al-Tabari notes, the Arabs were so thoroughly routed that they would not attempt another major invasion for decades. That is especially impressive as we take into account the fact that the Rashidun Caliphate would be successful in expanding Arab influence into virtually every direction possible, except for the Caucasus region. While the Islamization of the conquered regions indeed took decades and most often many centuries, such a process to the north was blocked thanks to Khazar defensive capabilities. The Islamic religion did not spread inside of Eurasia for the time being. But the conflict reignited in the early 8th century. The Arab general Maslama ibn Abd al-Malik, launched a massive campaign against the Khazars in 722. While he initially succeeded in capturing several Khazar cities, including their then capital Balanjar, the Khazars employed their traditional nomadic tactics of strategic retreat and counterattack. The Arab armies, stretched thin and far from their bases, found themselves struggling to maintain their conquests in the face of constant Khazar harassment. The intensity of these wars is vividly captured in both Arab and Armenian sources. The Armenian historian Wewand, who was also a priest and eyewitness for later events on the Caucasus, describes how the Khazar Khagan led a retaliatory campaign deep into Arab territory in 730, reaching as far as the city Ardabil in South Azerbaijan. The initial victory at Ardabil opened the gates for a Khazar invasion into the Middle East. The commander of the Turkic forces was Barjik, who is described by historian Al-Tabari as the son of the Khagan. It is possible that his mother was Prispit, the Hatan, and thus wife of the Khagan. However, as it is certain that she led armies herself, and even successfully campaigned into Armenia during the Arab Wars, we may assume that Prispit, sometimes called Barspek in the sources, was herself the actual ruler of Khazaria. In any case, her son, Barjik, advanced further into Iraq. The Arabs, striking back with vengeance, defeated his army near Mosul, however, and the Khazars retreated fully from the region. The Arabs time and time again had tried to enter the Caucasus, while only penetrating its frontier due to Khazar resistance. The Turkic armies, however, were successful in entering the territory of the now Umayyad Caliphate up to Mosul, near the later capital of the Islamic world, Baghdad. Why did the Khazars never return again, though? Would the conquest of these prosperous regions not have brought remarkable amounts of prestige to the Khazar royal court in Atil? One might assume that they reconsidered any retaliation due to the vast distances between Khazaria and the Arab center of power, in a similar vein as the Göktürks left the southern Caucasus, not just due to Tongyabgu's death, but also the long distance to their home base in Central Asia. Then again, it is striking that the Khazars were much more eager to conquer or drive away other peoples even deep into Volga Bulgaria or Kazakhstan, never granting their own Turkic neighbors a moment of relief. By 750, after more than a century of warfare, both sides reached a stalemate. The Khazars had successfully defended their independence, becoming the only major power to effectively resist Arab expansion. More importantly, they had secured their position as the dominant force in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. The stage was now set for perhaps the most intriguing chapter in Khazar history, their remarkable conversion to Judaism. Tengrism, the ancient faith of the steppes, was more than just a religion to the Turkic peoples. It was the very foundation of their worldview, as the shaman, actually called Kam among the Turks, was the most spiritual human of society. Tengrism included elements that prohibit us from simply categorizing it as a form of shamanism. Because the Kam was not at the center of the Turks' worldview. Instead, it was Tengri who served as both the supreme deity and the embodiment of the celestial order that governed all existence. In Turkic cosmology, the world was divided into three spheres: the celestial realm of Tengri above, the middle world of humans under the sight of Mother Umay, and the underworld ruled by Erlik Khan. The Khagan of every single Turkic empire was seen as the earthly representative of Tengri, chosen by heaven to rule with divine mandate, much like their Göktürk predecessors had claimed. This concept of divine election, the Kut, was central to Turkic political legitimacy. Sacred trees, mountains, and rivers dotted the spiritual landscape of the Turks. The ancient Orkhon inscriptions speak of the Yer-Su, the earth-water spirits, which alongside Tengri protected the Turkic peoples in everyday life. Even the cardinal directions held deep spiritual significance, with east being particularly sacred as the direction of the rising sun. That is why the Göktürks, whose name can also mean Eastern, were the most divine of all Turkic rulers. But unlike many other Turkic peoples who gradually embraced Islam or Christianity while retaining elements of their shamanic traditions, the Khazars would make an unprecedented choice. Their adoption of Judaism marks one of the most intriguing yet curious religious transformations in all of Eurasian history. The first hints of Jewish influence in the Khazar Empire appeared during their wars with the Arabs. While the Khazars successfully resisted Islamic military expansion, they found themselves at a crossroads. To their south lay the powerful Muslim Caliphate, while to the west, the Byzantine Empire represented Orthodox Christianity. Both powers actively sought to convert the peoples along their frontiers. The Khazars, however, chose a third path. According to the Schechter letter, a document discovered in the Cairo Geniza in 1912, the conversion of the Khazars to Judaism occurred in the 8th century. Instead of giving exact dates, the letter hints at events that implied Judaism to have become a state religion by that time. For example, after the Khazars converted to Judaism, some Alanians who already practiced Judaism came to save the Khazars from renewed Arab attack henceforth. The Alanians were a people who were guarding parts of the Caucasus already when the Göktürk Empire was in existence. They were the ones safeguarding the Byzantine envoy in the form of Zemarcus from Persian ambushes as he transpassed Anatolia to return home from Göktürk territory to Constantinople. Furthermore, the letter gives some prehistory that led to the conversion. It states that Jews fleeing persecution by Persians and Armenians joined the Khazars and were assimilated over time. Then, a strong and warlike leader named Sabriel became the head of the Khazars. As he was a distant descendant of Jewish settlers, with the persuasion of his wife Sarah, he converted to Judaism. As a result, more and more Khazar nobles followed suit. The name Sabriel actually refers to Bulan, who was the supreme Khagan in the middle of the 8th century. The Schechter letter claims that Bulan was most successful in campaigns in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Persia, possibly referring to his involvement in the Second Arab-Khazar War. Other important documents from regions west of the Khazar Empire give further hints about the conversion date. For example, the Expositio in Mattheum Evangelistum, the commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. It was written by the Benedictine monk Christian of Stavelot, as he taught in the Belgian city of Liège. The latest date for the composition of his commentary is the year 864, but some historians claim that it must have been written earlier. In it, he confidently states that a people called Khazari lived in the lands of Gog and Magog. These people were circumcised and observed all the laws of Judaism. Gog and Magog were often identified with a horrific pair of either monsters or peoples who, in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, were in some way, shape, or form connected to the end of days. While interpretations of where Gog and Magog were to be located varied over the centuries, it is likely that they were supposed to live in the very area that we have been talking about for years on this channel, the Eurasian steppe belt. Thus, with Khazari, Christian of Stavelot referenced the Khazars, correctly located them on the map, and claimed Judaism as the dominant religion. Another reference comes from Eldad ben Mahli Hadani, a Jewish merchant and traveler who originated from the southern Arabian Peninsula. In 883, he informed Spanish Jews that there was a Jewish polity in the east. He also told them that fragments of the legendary 10 lost tribes, part of the line of Simeon and half-line of Manasseh, dwelt in the land of the Khazar. They supposedly received tribute from 25 kingdoms and were thus a great power in their region. The Schechter letter, the commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, and the Chronicles of Eldad Hadani collectively suggest that the Khazars had embraced Judaism by the 8th century. It seems reasonable to conclude that Judaism spread in Khazaria as a result of an influx of Jewish migrants. The initial wave of immigration is thought to have occurred during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, the Caliph of the Abbasid Empire, between the 8th and 9th centuries. Under his orders, Jews and Christians were required to wear distinctive symbols on their clothing, abstain from riding horses, and endure other forms of similar indignity. The Jews leaving the Near East then found refuge in Khazar lands, where they were free to roam as they wanted. The Tengrist Turkic society was not conducive to religious persecution or humiliation of any kind, after all. Consequently, even before the Jewish conversion, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and people of other faiths were present in Khazaria, mostly as merchants and traders. In 861, Cyril and Methodius, brothers and Byzantine Christian theologians, visited the Khazar Empire. Later, they mentioned that the ruler of the Khazars would have been Zechariah. A century after Bulan's reign, Zechariah is the first Khazar ruler we know of not to carry a Turkic name, but an Abrahamic one. Indeed, all following rulers cultivated non-Turkic names from now on. Examples are Obadiah, Isaac, Aaron, and Benjamin. Under Obadiah, the process of Jewish influence reached its climax. He made sweeping religious reforms by establishing synagogues and schools, bringing in Jewish scholars from Mesopotamia, and introducing the Talmud and rabbinic learning. This suggests that the Khazars adopted not just biblical Judaism, but the full rabbinic tradition. The conversion appears to have been primarily among the ruling elite at first. The Kagan, the Bek, and the major nobility accepted the new faith, while the general population likely adhered to a diverse array of beliefs, including Tengrism, Islam, and Christianity. This religious transformation had profound political implications. By choosing Judaism, the Khazars maintained their independence from both Christian Byzantium and the Muslim Caliphate. They could now engage with both powers as equals on an intellectual level too, while preserving their unique identity. As the Arabic chronicler Ibn al-Faqih observed, the Khazar ruler's standard bore the Star of David, yet he still commanded the respect of both Muslim and Christian rulers. However, al-Faqih also made the following remark: all Khazars are Jewish. And this brings us to the main topic of this video, and indeed, the most important issue of Khazar history. It is difficult to determine the exact impact of the Jewish state religion on the inhabitants of Khazaria. While the King's List, or rather Khaganate list of the Khazars, makes certain the Jewish faith of all rulers, a complete conversion of all peoples is not certain at all. Remember, the core ruling dynasty and the elite warriors of the Khazar Empire were Turkic. An Oghuric Turkic dialect was also the lingua franca of the state, but over time, Khazaria became a multicultural melting pot of many different cultures and ethnicities. The more power and influence the Khazars gained, the more migrants they attracted from faraway lands. There are more sources from which we can deduce the impact of Judaism on the common people. The 10th century Persian geography text, Hudud al-Alam, describes how the Khazars maintained their traditional tribal structure and military organization. The common people, particularly those living in the steppes, continued their nomadic lifestyle and ancient customs. Muhammad ibn Hawqal, an Arab traveler from Mesopotamia, there were people of multiple religions living in Khazaria, with plenty of mosques, churches, and synagogues. So therefore, Muslim mosques stood alongside Christian churches and Jewish synagogues in Khazar cities, especially in the capital. Ibn Hawqal also notes with amazement that the Supreme Court of Atil included 2 Jews, 2 Muslims, 2 Christians, and a so-called pagan, so a Tengrist, to ensure that every subject could be judged according to their own religious laws. Before we continue with the fatal question of the spread of Judaism among the common Khazar populace, and thus conclude with the implications for later Eastern European and Jewish history, let us quickly return to the world map and Khazar geopolitics. The religious choice of the ruling elite certainly reshaped Khazar diplomacy. Up to this point, the Khazar Empire had served as a buffer state between the Arab caliphates to the south, the Byzantine Empire to the west, and various nomadic and mostly Turkic groups in the Eurasian steppe belt. But while the Khazars fought many wars against both the Arabs and their own Turkic kin, their relationship with the Byzantine Empire was more nuanced. The Göktürk intervention in the Byzantine-Persian War of 626 under the command of Tong Yabgu serves as an entry point into Khazar-Byzantine affairs. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this relationship occurred in 695, when the deposed Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, known as the Slit Nose after his mutilation, sought refuge in Khazar territory. The Khazar Khagan, Buzir, not only granted him asylum, but cemented their alliance through a marriage between Justinian and his sister, who took the Byzantine name Theodora after converting to Christianity. This alliance was tested, however, when the Byzantine usurper Tiberius III attempted to bribe Buzir to assassinate Justinian. It was Theodora herself who warned her husband of the plot, allowing him to escape, but not before killing 2 Khazar officials in the process. Despite this bloody episode, when Justinian later regained the throne, he sent for Theodora, who was crowned Augusta. This suggests that both powers valued their alliance above personal grievances. The Byzantine-Khazar connection grew even stronger in the face of Arab expansion. Emperor Leo III orchestrated another significant dynastic marriage, wedding his son Constantine to a Khazar princess named Tsitsak in the year 732. Tsitsak's actual name might have been Çiçek, flower in Turkic. Upon her conversion to Christianity, she took the name Irene, and their son, the future Leo IV, would be known to history as Leo the Khazar. The Khazar influence in Byzantium extended beyond marriage alliances. By the mid-9th century, Khazar warriors served in the elite Byzantine Hetairaya bodyguard, protecting the very emperors with whom their people had forged such strong ties. Their presence in Constantinople itself speaks to the deep trust between these two powers. These Byzantine connections played a crucial role in establishing the Khazars as a legitimate power in the eyes of the medieval world. Unlike other steppe peoples who were viewed merely as uncivilized threats, the Khazars were seen as sophisticated enough to marry into the imperial Eastern Roman family of what was then the most prestigious Christian empire in the world. The decline of the Khazar Empire was not a sudden collapse, but rather a gradual process of territorial loss, economic decline, and shifting alliances. By the mid-10th century, new powers were rising around the Khazars that would ultimately challenge their dominance of Eastern Europe and the steppes. The first major blow came from an unexpected quarter, the Kievan Rus. Prince Sviatoslav, breaking with his mother Olga's more cautious policy, launched a devastating campaign against the Khazar Empire in 965. The Russian Primary Chronicle tells us of his successful assault on the mighty fortress of Sarkel on the Don River, built with Byzantine help decades earlier to guard against nomadic incursions. Its loss marked a decisive shift in the balance of power. The method of Sviatoslav's conquest reveals much about the changing power dynamics in Eastern Europe. According to contemporary sources, the Rus' prince first undermined Khazar authority by turning their own vassals against them. The Viatich tribes, longtime tributaries of the Khazars, were given a stark choice: ally with Kiev or face military consequences. Those who resisted were forcibly brought under Rus' control. Most tellingly, Sviatoslav employed the age-old strategy of using nomads against nomads. He recruited Oghuz and Pecheneg mercenaries for his campaign, a brilliant tactical move to counter the renowned Khazar cavalry. The devastation wrought by this combined force was total. After taking Sarkel and sacking the wealthy Crimean port of Kerch, Sviatoslav's armies struck at Atal itself. contemporary witness whose account survives in Arabic sources paints a haunting picture of the aftermath. The Rus attacked, and not a grape or a raisin was left, not a leaf on a branch. The geographer al-Maqdisi, the first historian to identify himself as Palestinian, notes that from then on, merchants bypassed the Khazar territories, preferring routes through the Kievan Rus or Volga, Bulgaria. The loss of trade revenue, which had been the basis of Khazar power, proved disastrous. Meanwhile, the Oghuz Turks seized their opportunity and by 985, as recorded by Ibn al-Athir, had conquered large swaths of Eastern Khazar territory. In the year 1016, according to the Armenian historian Stephanos of Taran, a combined Byzantine-Russian force dealt the final blow to what remained of Khazar power. The last Khazar Khagan, whose name is lost to history, fled to the steppes with his remaining followers. The fall of Atil did not mark the complete disappearance of the Khazars. While their empire had crumbled, various sources tell us of surviving Khazar communities throughout their former territories. Al-Muqaddasi describes a region beyond the Caspian Sea where Khazar Jews still lived, albeit in diminished circumstances, maintaining sheep herds and honey production. Much later, the Jewish German traveler Petahiah of Regensburg, who journeyed through the Crimea in the 1170s and later traveled as far as Egypt and Seljuk Turkish Iran, describes meeting people who followed Jewish customs but maintained distinct traditions unknown to other Jewish communities. His account suggests that these communities preserved elements of both their Jewish faith and their Turkic heritage. An intriguing episode occurs in 1016 when Byzantine sources tell us of a ruler named Georgius Tsul. His Christian name suggests the religious diversity that persisted among the Khazar elite. After his defeat by a joint Rus-Byzantine force, another Khazar ruler named Sennacherib in Upper Media, so South Azerbaijan, was forced to sue for peace. The Khazars continued to play a role in regional politics even after their empire's fall. In 1024, we find them fighting alongside Mstislav of Chernigov in his attempt to seize Kiev. By the 1080s, the Rus prince Oleg Sviatoslavich still claimed the title Archon of Khazaria, suggesting that the concept of Khazar territory retained some political significance. However, references to the Khazars largely disappear from historical records by the 12th century. By the 13th century, they survived in Russian folklore only as Jewish heroes in the Zemlya Jidovskaya, the land of the Jews. Their population had been largely absorbed into the successor peoples of the steppes, leaving behind only scattered place names and cultural memories. But where did the people of Khazaria really go? Did they just disappear all of a sudden? Were they really assimilated by new powers? The question of Khazar legacy extends far beyond mere cultural influence. A wealth of evidence suggests that significant portions of Eastern European Jewry may actually trace their ancestry to the Khazar realm. This connection, while controversial, is supported by multiple lines of evidence that deserve careful consideration. Consider first the demographic puzzle that historians have long grappled with: the sudden appearance of large Jewish populations in Eastern Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries. The Hungarian chronicler Simon of Keza, writing in the 13th century, noted that many Jews arrived in Hungary from a country called Khazaria. The numbers involved are particularly telling, because while Western European Jewish communities grew gradually over centuries, Eastern European Jewish communities seemed to appear rapidly, and in regions that coincidentally either overlapped with former Khazar territories and trade routes or were situated near the Khazar periphery. The evidence extends beyond demographics. The Cairo-Geniza documents reveal differences between Western and Eastern European Jewish commercial practices. Eastern European Jewish merchants operated along the very same trade routes that had been the lifelines of the Khazar Empire, using commercial terms and practices that differed from their Western counterparts. The 12th century traveler Benjamin of Tudela noted distinct customs among Eastern European Jews that he found foreign to both Sephardic and Western European traditions. Centuries later, the question of Khazar ancestry among Eastern European Jews appeared on a larger scale. Taking various arguments into account, it is perhaps best to let those speak who were themselves of Jewish descent. Like Abraham Furkovich, a rabbi active in modern-day Ukraine, he proclaimed that the members of his Turkic-speaking sect were descended from Turkic converts to Judaism. Furkovich belonged to the Karaites of Crimea, a small group of Judaic people who spoke and still speak Turkic languages. By the 19th century, they began to distinguish themselves from other Jewish groups, sending envoys to the Russian rulers to plead for exemptions from harsh anti-Jewish legislation. Successfully, they were granted the same rights as their Christian and pagan Tatar neighbors. Later, they were considered non-Jews by the Nazi invaders. This left the Karaites untouched by the horrors of World War II, unlike other Turkic-speaking Jews like the Krimchak that were almost wiped out. The Karaite situation was picked up by Ernest Renan and others in the late 19th century, which initiated controversial debates among European intellectual elites in the early 20th century, on the eve of World War II and the extermination of most European Jews. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, discussions picked up again. The most prominent and important post-war advocate of the so-called Khazar hypothesis was Arthur Koestler, an Austro-Hungarian author born into a Jewish family. He proposed that after the conversion of the Khazar Empire, the Khazars time and time again westwards into Eastern Europe, with the largest wave of migrants arriving after the destruction of the state in the 11th century. Another notable author is Shlomo Sand. He published his book, The Invention of the Jewish People, in which he also proclaimed that Ashkenazi Jews in Europe were directly descended from Khazars. While Shlomo Sand is a self-proclaimed anti-Zionist and thus opposed to the idea of a Jewish nation in the form of Israel, Arthur Koestler's book was also panned by critics. In general, the Khazar hypothesis has been criticized for decades. One of the main arguments against this theory is that DNA analysis would disprove a Khazar ancestry of Ashkenazi Jews. This, however, is not entirely true. There are various genetic studies of Jewish peoples that paint a more nuanced picture. According to a study from 2004, 35% to 43% of Jewish men are in the paternal line known as haplogroup J. This very haplogroup is particularly present in the Middle East and the Caucasus, the former base of the Khazar Empire. A 2003 study of the Y chromosome pointed to multiple origins for Ashkenazi Levites, a priestly class who comprise approximately 4% of Ashkenazi Jews. It found that haplogroup R1A1A, which is uncommon in the Middle East but dominant in Eastern Europe, is present in over 50% of Ashkenazi Levite. The study thus suggested a founding event involving very few European men, occurring at a time close to the initial formation and settlement of the Ashkenazi community as a possible explanation. This may indicate a Khazar origin, with a few Khazars moving into Eastern European communities, settling there, intermixing, and founding new families. Kevin Allen Brooke, who wrote numerous articles and a very concise book about the Khazars, found the following. In a 2022 article, he pinpointed the Ashkenazic branch of N9A3 as the daughter subclade of a variety found among Bashkirs, an Oghuric Turkic people of the Ural region and distant relatives of Magyars and Huns, and proposes that the former could come from a Khazar woman. In a 2009 study, 4 Jewish groups, Ashkenazi, Turkish, Moroccan, and Tunisian, were compared. The researchers found genetic similarities, especially between Ashkenazi Jews and the Circassians, a group from the Caucasus, again, the very region inhabited by the Khazars for centuries. One of the most important contemporary proponents of the Khazar hypothesis is the American-Israeli researcher Aaron El-Hayek. In a 2012 study, he concluded the following: strong evidence for the Khazar hypothesis is the clustering of European Jews with the populations that, in his opinion, resided on opposite ends of ancient Khazaria: Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijani Jews. Because Caucasus populations remained relatively isolated in the Caucasus region, and because there are no records of Caucasus populations mass migrating to Eastern and Central Europe prior to the fall of Khazaria, these findings imply a shared origin for European Jews and Caucasus populations. So after nearly an hour of extensive storytelling and academic analysis, you might have more questions on your mind than you had before watching this documentary. The same will apply to anyone, be it interested layman, armchair historian, or actual academic, who ever dealt with Khazar history, or really any peoples that emerged from the steppes. There are indeed many open-ended questions that we cannot answer for a simple reason. Most information that we could have about the Khazars were lost in time. Nonetheless, it is possible to draw some conclusions confidently. The story of the Khazar Empire stands as one of history's most remarkable yet underappreciated sagas. From their origins as Turkic nomads from the Göktürk dynasty, originating in the Altai Mountains, to their emergence as a sophisticated trading empire, from their unique religious transformation to their lasting impact on Eastern European Jewry, the Khazars challenge our understanding of medieval history. Their political achievements were extraordinary. For 3 centuries, they successfully balanced between the Islamic Caliphate and Byzantine Empire, while simultaneously managing the complex dynamics of the Eurasian steppes. Their military prowess halted Arab expansion northward, effectively protecting Eastern Europe from Islamic conquest. Their commercial acumen transformed the regions between the Caspian and Black Seas into a thriving trade zone. For the Khazars, the world was not black and white, but rather many shades of gray. They were as pragmatic as it gets. This mentality was reciprocal to their original pragmatism. As their once glorious Turkic Khaganate was left in shambles, the core Turkic Khazar groups had to reorganize themselves without any help. They had to assert themselves against many smaller and a few larger tribes and federations in the Caucasus. As they won battles and gained new followers, they incorporated those once hostile people into their domain. As they expanded into the Ponto-Caspian steppe and reached as far as the Don River, they also consolidated imperial tradition of the Turkic kind in this very region. The last Turkic empire that had had a profound impact was that of the Huns, 4 centuries prior. But it was their religious and cultural transformation that truly set the Khazars apart from their neighbors, and even other steppe and Turkic peoples. The Khazars' adoption of Judaism, while maintaining their Turkic political and military traditions, created something entirely new in world history. This synthesis showed that seemingly rigid cultural and religious boundaries could be more fluid than anyone had imagined. The evidence we've examined, historical, archaeological, and genetic, strongly suggests that the Khazar legacy lived on long after their empire's collapse. Their influence can be traced in the emergence of Jewish communities across Eastern Europe, in distinctive cultural practices, in trading patterns, and even in the genetic makeup of various populations. Whether the Khazar hypothesis is really true, whether most of the European Jews that were exterminated during World War II actually stemmed from the Khazar people, there is no answer to that. However, with all the evidence and implications that we do have at hand in mind, Khan's Den suggests not to discard and reject such theories easily. In our contemporary world, this topic is very controversial, yet it is important to engage in. Because most importantly, the Khazar Empire reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we imagine. In an age when we often think of civilizations as clearly defined and separate, the Khazars show us a world where nomads could become merchants, where steppe warriors could embrace sedentary religions, and where cultural identities could be both transformed and preserved. As we reflect on their remarkable civilization, we're reminded of that single line preserved in the Kiev letter and written in the old Turkic running script from the Göktürk era. It says, Okurum. In Khazar Turkic, modern Turkish and all other Turkic languages, this means, I will read it, or I have read it. In a tragic twist of events, all sources that you have heard about today were not written by the Khazars by themselves. We have no texts from their realm left. It was destroyed nearly entirely. Ibn Halkal, in an account unrelated to the Khazars, once noted that Turk soldiers had the precedence of every other race, and the caliphs always chose them on account of their excellent jervises, their obedient disposition, their bravery, and their fidelity. While the Khazars slowly fell out of place among the Turkic steppe world and lost their ways completely by the 10th century, other Turkic peoples were on their way from Central Asia to Europe and the Near East. Almost simultaneous to the fall of the Khazars was the rise of another Turkic group, which we have mentioned a few times on this channel, the Kipchaks. Their rise to power initiated what is arguably the greatest era in all of Turkic steppe history, ever. One last note before we end this ordeal. Khan's Den is now nearing its 5th birthday. On its way to 100,000 subscribers, is not here to bring light to the history of the Turkic and steppe peoples, but to merely fill the gaps that were, sometimes intentionally, left blank in history books for many decades now. Certainly, that can feel illuminating to our viewers, and that fills the producer with joy and pride. But filling these gaps is not easy, as the production is done by this one man alone. If you like this documentary and would want to support him, consider becoming a member right here on YouTube or on patreon.com/khansden. On that note, thank you to all our members for your ongoing support.